right, now mindless nonsense. It was 2 in the morning. I was sitting in my kitchen. No, I wasn't. I was sitting in my living room. Doesn't matter. You can see the TV from either room. So wherever you think I was, it's fine. I was watching a movie on television. It was the night before buck season. It was about 2 in the morning, and I was just waiting, for the sun to come up so I could go deer hunting, when I heard a knock at the back door. Well, I knew not to answer, because I knew, I started this story in the wrong place. So we're just going to go back, just a little ways. Long ago, far away, on the other side. No, I'll get to it. Just give me a minute. It's been a long weekend. This is why I love live audiences, right? When we're standing in our attic or our basement or whatever miserable place we had to shoot videos to upload to storytelling festivals for the last 2 years, you make a mistake like that and you're like, daggone it, and you break 7 things and you go upstairs and you cry. But I make a mistake in front of you people and I'm like, I made a mistake. Now I'm going to make it worse, right? So, one of the reasons we love you, right? Isn't it true? We love you people because you're here, you're with us now. So when I was 5 years old, I have 2 children. This story doesn't really have a beginning is the problem. My children are now 18 and 21, which means I have been a parent now collectively for an amazing 39 years. But one thing I learned early on as a parent, and I know I learned this as a child from a child's perspective when I was about 5 years old, is there are things that a father will teach a child that, if the mother knew, would kill her. And I think I started learning this from a child's perspective when I was about 5, because we had a dog named Deacon, and every night my dad would take Deacon for a walk. See, here's one of the beginnings. Every night my dad would take Deacon for a walk, and when I was 5, I was deemed old enough to go on that walk with Dad and Deacon. And right away, I started learning things I know my mother did not want me to know. Because Deacon would stop at every tree, fire hydrant, and lamppost along the way, sniff around the base of it, lift his leg, and do his thing. I said, Dad, what's that about? He said, well, that's the way Deacon marks his territory. He leaves his scent on those things, and then if another dog comes into this neighborhood, he smells that. He knows this land belongs to Deacon. He'll leave it alone. I said, well, what if that dog wants the land? Dad said, well, then he leaves his mark. And the next time Deacon and that dog get together, they either talk about it or they fight about it to see who gets the land. Well, I was only 5 years old. It didn't really make that much sense to me. But it did give me a whole new respect for what real estate agents did all day long. But you have to understand that right next door to us lived a little old lady. Her name was Mrs. Crankberry, and she was the single meanest woman I have ever met. Her house was made out of bones and just like white feathers, and there was a big snake on the ground. She didn't have any teeth. And she was the meanest woman I have ever met in my life. She was that lady in town who had her hair done religiously twice a year. She'd have it put straight up in a sort of a cone and then sealed with some sort of concrete all-weather sealant so that it wouldn't move for 6 months. She was the chairwoman down at the church for the committee for little old ladies who want to be angry about something. But there's some twist of the great universal irony, the great yin-yang. Because she was so evil, she had the most beautiful yard I had ever seen. Her yard was a Four Seasons resort to a 5-year-old. It had a slope in the back that was perfect for sledding in the winter. Just on the other side, her yard was Skidder Creek, and right in the middle of her yard was a giant oak tree that used to just rain acorns all autumn long. But I could not step foot into that yard. Even if one of those acorns were to drop out of that tree and roll into my yard. If Mrs. Crankberry saw me pick it up, she would come out her back door, lower that spike of hair, and chase me like a rabid rhinoceros. And this was back in the 1970s, when it was still perfectly legal to hurt your neighbor's children. So it was a dangerous time for me, but I wanted that yard. I coveted that yard. And one day I was sitting out in my own backyard, and I've told you I'm the last of 5 children. So my mother was more like a jailhouse guard than a maternal character by the time I was 5 years old. She'd look out the window about every 8 minutes, and then I had 7 minutes and 55 seconds to do whatever I wanted to do. So she looked out the window. By that same time, Mrs. Crankberry came out of her house, got in her car, and drove away. And I suddenly had an idea. I got up out of my yard. I walked into Mrs. Crankberry's yard. I went straight over to that big oak tree. I got down on my hands and knees, and I sniffed all around the base of it. Now, I didn't know exactly what I was sniffing for, but I knew it was part of the process. Then I just sort of stood up, dropped my pants, and made that tree mine. And it occurred to me that I had never once seen Mrs. Crankberry tinkle on that tree. So I didn't even know if it belonged to her. More than that, I was only 5. She was like 105, though. So I figured if it came to it, I could take her in a fight. So every couple of days, I'd sneak over there, make something else mine. And then she died. I don't think it had anything to do with me going to the bathroom in her yard. But I can promise you that within 2 weeks of her death, everything 18 inches and below in that yard belonged to me. So you can see how it came as quite a surprise when I came home from the grocery store with my mother one day, and there was a moving van parked out in front of that house, which I had rightfully claimed. There were people moving stuff in. I went in the backyard. There was a little kid about my age putting toys out all over the place. Well, that was the last straw. I knew what I had to do. I walked over into that yard in front of God and everybody. I went straight up to that big oak tree. I dropped my pants and I started going. Well, that little kid thought that was pretty funny. He walked over to that tree, dropped his pants, and he started going. Well, I knew what I had to do. I reached over and I slugged him as hard as I could. And then he slugged me back. So there we were, 2 5-year-old boys with our pants around our ankles fighting to the death. Well, pretty soon our mother saw us. And you know how mothers are about stuff like that. They came over and made us pull up our pants. Apologize to each other, introduce ourselves. Now I felt like I knew that kid pretty well by that point. But it turns out his name was Skeeter Bart. And after that, me and Skeeter were best friends. But having Skeeter for your best friend is sort of like having a head cold for your best friend, because you never feel right and he won't go away. And even at the tender age of 5, he was always coming up with these plans, these schemes, these ideas that even then were just barely legal. But he had such a convincing way about himself that I always had to go along with what he said. First day we ever went to school, we had not been in kindergarten for more than 10 minutes. Skeeter nudges me, and he says, "Hey, don't you think that we ought to make this classroom ours?" Next thing we knew, we were in the nurse's office. They hadn't invented the school psychologist by this point. We had to stand over the toilet and prove that we knew what to do. Well, it was taking a while, because we were tapped out. I never thought about this with cigarette timing, you know? Like Josh was talking about. Well, it was taking a while. Because we were tapped out, but that's the perfect time. Anyway, Skeeter went pale. I said, "What's the matter, buddy?" He said, "I was just thinking about it." He said, "My brother had a squirt gun. He squirted somebody with it, and they took it away from him." Some of you will get it later, I guess. He said, "What do you suppose they're going to do to us?" Well, we got through that unscathed, if you will. And if you jump ahead, about 11 years, see, here we go. I was sitting in my living room. It was 2 in the morning. I was watching television. The day before buck season, I was waiting for the sun to come up so I could go deer hunting when I heard a knock at the back door. And I knew not to answer it, because I knew if anybody was knocking on my back door at 2 in the morning the day before buck season, it had to be Skeeter. And if Skeeter was knocking on my back door at 2 in the morning the day before buck season, he had come up with a plan. And I didn't want to go along with it. But there was no free will involved. I was sucked up off the couch and drawn to the back door. And when I opened the door, there stood Skeeter, with a diabolical grin on his face and a paper bag in his hand. He didn't say nothing, but I invited him in anyway. It was like letting a vampire into my house. He came in, sat down at the kitchen table, he put that paper bag on the floor. And I went over and I brewed up a pot of coffee because I could tell it was going to be a long night. Finally, I brought the coffee over and I set it down on the table. And I sat down. And Skeeter said to me, "I've been up all night sewing." Well, I wasn't used to my best buddy sewing. I didn't know what to make of that. But he reached down and he opened up that paper bag and he reached in and he pulled out something long and brown and furry. And he sort of flipped it open and pulled it on his head, and by gosh, that kid could sew. What he had made was a perfect replica of an 8-point buck's head. And he said to me from inside that deer mask, "Don't worry, I made one for you too." So there we were, two young bucks drinking coffee at the kitchen table. No, it is a bad joke, but if you'd thought of it, you'd have put it in your story. But I knew that couldn't be the whole plan. And after a minute, Skeeter said, "That ain't the whole plan." He said, "I also took a mannequin. I dressed him in hunter's orange, and I tied him to the hood of my truck." He said, "What we are going to do," not do you want to. He said, "What we are going to do is drive around town like it's people season." And we got one. He said, "We'll drive up to the checking station, we'll check our human, everybody will think it's funny." Well, it was funny. But it's precisely the sort of funny that you don't want your dad to find out that it was you who did it. So we decided to go hide out. We went up the old service road at the state park. We were sitting up there in Skeeter's truck. Skeeter had just got his truck, brand new that summer, only had about 80,000 miles on the odometer. But the odometer was in the glove box and was mechanically disassociated with every other part of the vehicle. First time I ever went to roll down the passenger side window, I took about a quarter turn on the crank, and the window just went thunk, and never saw it again. Which was fine in the summer because the truck didn't have air conditioning. But that night it was about 20 degrees, and the wind was blowing right in that window. There was frost building up on both sides of the windshield. We didn't have enough money to buy enough gasoline to run the engine, to run the heater. We had like 6 hours to kill before dawn. So I don't know if I've made this clear, but we were pretty dumb. We weren't dressed properly. I was freezing to death. And finally I reached in that bag and I pulled out one of those masks and I put it on. Well, it was warm and cozy inside that mask. Skeeter reached in that bag, pulled out his mask, and he put his on. Pretty soon we fell asleep. Well, when I fell asleep, my head fell right out that open window. And a snake crawled up and bit me. It didn't, but everybody else had a snake in their store. So I thought I had to put one in there. I didn't know if there was a theme, so... Except Barbara. Barbara just had Godzilla, but that's a lizard, so I thought maybe I'm missing something. Anyway, my head fell right out that open window. And you know how when you're sleeping, somebody will be doing something around you, and your subconscious will pick up on it, yell at you, "Get up, do something." But daggone it, there is a snake in this story. I forgot about it. Forget the last snake, because there's an actual snake in this story. I knew the plan the whole time. So sometimes, though, you're asleep and something will happen, like a snake will crawl in your sleeping bag. Can't believe I didn't realize that was the next line in the story. So a snake will crawl in your sleeping bag, and your subconscious will be like, "Okay, wake up, open your eyes, but don't move." Well, that's what my subconscious was telling me. So I just sort of opened my eyes. And sure enough, about 30 yards down the road, there were two bright lights, about that far apart, about that high off the ground. The sun was just starting to turn the sky gray. And as the sun, I could just barely make out the silhouette of a large American sedan. And as the sun came up over the mountaintop, two sunbeams came down the mountain, up that dirt road, over the back of that car, and across the top of that car. And one of those sunbeams went through a blue light, and one of those sunbeams went through a red light. And the door of that car opened up and Sheriff Hasbro started to get out. Now, Sheriff Hasbro was a big man. He was about 6'8", 6'9", weighed about 480 pounds. But it wasn't all muscle. So it took him a long time to get out of a Ford Tempo. Our county didn't really have a budget. And as he was getting out of that car, I was poking Skeeter, trying to wake him up. And pretty soon, Sheriff Hasbro was creeping down the road. He had that big flashlight on his shoulder. He was coming in slow. Y'all know that saying, discretion is the better part of valor? Well, Sheriff Hasbro was real into that better part of valor. But I don't want to call the man a coward. Because after all, you don't want to just run up on a pickup truck with a guy tied to the hood and 2 deer sitting in the cab. And I was laying there thinking the smartest thing to do is to do nothing. But the smartest thing isn't really my strong suit. And I don't know if you were ever a teenager in a small town. Might be the same for being a teenager in a big town. I just can't speak to that. But if you were ever a teenager in a small town, you have to understand that Half Dollar, West Virginia, we had 2 streets. One was called Main Street. The other one was called, no, that ain't Main Street. So when you live in a town that size, you realize that the police get bored. So they come looking for you to see what you're doing. And Skeeter and I were conscientious young men, so we endeavored to participate in activities which allowed the local law enforcement to practice the skills that they had learned at the academy. And I was laying there thinking about that as Sheriff Hasbro got closer. I thought the smartest thing to do is just do nothing. But then I started thinking, how many times in your life do you have the opportunity to scare the pants off the duly elected officials of your county? I thought, I'm just going to make a little deer noise. So I just sort of went, "Puh!" I know. It's not a good deer noise, but that's what I did. And it was effective. Sheriff Hasbro, all 6'8", 480 pounds of him, he just left the ground. He jumped so high that Skeeter had time to start the truck, defrost the windshield, and drive underneath of him before he ever came back down. We just made our way around that sheriff's cruiser, headed on into town. Now, we were 16 years old. We hadn't been to law school, right? But, you know, we had watched a lot of Starsky and Hutch, and he never said freeze. He hadn't said you were under arrest. He hadn't read us our rights. How were we supposed to know we were in trouble? Who knew that it was illegal to impersonate a deer? We just headed on into town. Now, the road into Half Dollar, West Virginia is pretty straight by West Virginia standards. But it is one of these up and down jobs. And after a little while, we could see that sheriff's car coming up over the hills behind us. Now, he wasn't gaining on us, but I wanted to find out what was going on. So I switched on the CB and turned it to the police channel, just in time to hear Sheriff Hasbro say, "Tom," Tom was the deputy, he said, "Tom, I don't care if you think I am crazy. There are 2 deer driving Skeeter Bart's pickup truck down the highway. And I believe they got Skeeter tied to the hood." And Tom said, "Well, good." I mean, you can see where that might hurt our feelings. Switched off the CB, we headed on into town. This was 1986. This was small town West Virginia. Y'all know what I'm talking about. This was before the internet, before CNN. We didn't even get public radio back there in Half Dollar. So what people did for their news and information in the morning was turn on their police scanners. So when we came around the corner into Main Street, there were people lined up and down both sides of the street, drinking coffee with their curlers in. I thought H.G. Wells was landing spaceships on the courthouse lawn. I wanted to find out what was going on, so I turned the CB back on just in time to hear Tom say, "Sheriff Hasbro, I called the FBI just like you said." And the FBI called Animal Control. And they said you should consider them 2 deer armed and dangerous. They said you're allowed to use lethal force if necessary. But that was a little bit more than we had bargained for. So Skeeter just sort of pulled to a stop, and Sheriff Hasbro pulled in behind him, After a minute, he got out of his car and came over and made us take off our masks. And then he yelled at us for a good long time. Gave us each a ticket for the crime of mayhem, dressed as an 8-point buck. We each had to pay a little fine and do a little community service. But I think what we learned from all of this is that they say that true forgiveness only comes after you have honestly repented of your sins, after you promise to never do the same thing again, and after you swear to never take any glory from the original action. So I think I can safely say, with that in mind, that Skeeter and I will never be forgiven for what we did that day. Thank you very much. I know I speak for the storytellers that are still here. We don't care about the ones that left already. No, what's left? We're the 3-letter first name storytellers, which is what we're starting a movement. With printing prices getting so high, you just need to, me, Donnie, Kim, Tim, you can bring in Ed, because that's cheap, that's only 2 letters. So yeah, just think 3-letter, 2-letter storyteller. Andy's got 4 letters. He's out. Okay. But I know you had Letter Greedy, Barbara McBride Smith. I mean, so Lynn Ford and Bill Lepp, 7 letters, just in and out, right? Sorry, Len Cooper. What I'm trying to say here is we have what I call or had performance scurvy. We don't just do this because it's a paycheck. This is a part of us that has to be fed. I'm not kidding. I don't know if you can tell, but I enjoy being on stage. And not doing this for 2 years, really, I'm not kidding. It was like mentally debilitating. I'm sure it was the same for you. Not the only person that suffered during COVID. But getting back to live audiences has just been our goal, and all the storytellers across the board. And I'm sure as audience members, you have wanted the same thing. Alan said earlier, this was probably the first festival to go virtual. It was one of the first festivals when everything got canceled, because stuff got canceled in March, and when this is so. They jumped on that virtual thing right away, and we as tellers, again, we're so appreciative of this festival and all of the festivals that said just record your stuff, and we're still going to pay you because we needed that to happen. So thank you so much, not just to Alan, but to everybody who is on this committee, who volunteers here, who feeds us, who houses us, who mows the lawn so we can get here. Just thank you so much to Camp Bethel, and you audience members who supported that as well. It was so important for us, but again, we're just so glad to be back. Come back next year. I don't even know who's going to be here. Probably people with longer names. But come back. Come back anyway. Support them. Go find other storytelling festivals. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you somewhere else.